Good day, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Elysée Nouvet. Dr. Nouvet is a medical anthropologist and associate professor at Western University. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Nouvet.
My pleasure.
So, just to start off, I'm pronouncing that correctly, right? I want to make sure that I get the name exactly right. It's Dr. Nouvet?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you. Elysée Nouvet.
Okay, perfect. So, starting from the beginning, where were you born and what were your early informative years like?
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to look back like this. It's a nice way to start an interview when we're talking about our work, since we all are situated and unique individuals, and that definitely shapes our trajectory as researchers. I'm born in Ottawa. My parents moved there, my father for work, and then my mom was a school teacher. I'm from a family of four kids. And my early years were spent lots of playing outside in very cold weather, lots of enjoyment of the snow. I skied every weekend. We had a family pass to a local ski hill, and lots of reading because we had very strict rules around consumption of TV, and there
Hmm.
was no internet when I was little.
Wow.
So yeah, lots of I was a bookworm.
That's really interesting because I remember in my childhood too. My parents had a strict rule. I had to read at least 2 hours a day. Didn't matter what it was.
That is a lot.
Yeah. So in the summer, this rule was instituted very forcefully, where if I wanted to watch TV or if I wanted to go play outside, it would have to be after I did 2 hours of reading in something. And also, I would get tested on this, so I'd have to like write a little something like a one pager of what I read. And so it would
Wow.
be, I would read this World Atlas book that I had, which was, I would learn about a different country each day, and then I would do a little write up. So I think that I've actually heard that quite a few times with other people that I've spoken to as well. That seems like a common thing, which is that if you can get your love of reading started early on and your love of
Mm.
learning, it really does shape the trajectory of your life a little bit.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for sure for the access to books. And we went to the library once a week since the earliest time I could remember. And the public library is a favorite place in my mind that I can go to if I ever need a place of calm because of the really good memories from being a kid.
Mhm.
But also the world of having access to other people's realities and experiences through books. I did read a lot of fiction as well as nonfiction, and there's an element of escape, but there's also an element which I've come to learn is really important for the development of empathy when you get to imagine in what other people live and how other people make the decisions they make. And I think it's good that you point out a love of reading, but also a love of learning, because one thing I've noticed with my own kids is that they really don't read outside what they're reading on their screens, but they still have a love of learning and go down the rabbit hole with YouTube on fascinating topics. And they have at least as much information about diverse topics as I did at that age, thanks to YouTube and other channels put out there by professors or people with particular interests, really esoteric interests. So it's not just books. And we're in an interesting period in that there are these other ways for some people who just never would like reading or prefer other forms of learning.
Yeah. And speaking of learning, what has your academic journey been like? Starting, let's just say, from high school and then beyond.
I did start studying for my undergraduate in social and cultural anthropology in Montreal. I went to Concordia University for undergrad. My academic journey was shaped somewhat by finances. I applied to a couple of universities, and then ended up going where I got some money. And from there, I just continued to follow opportunities that would avoid me going into debt, actually, but while allowing me to pursue a passion for the study of ways of being human across cultures. So social cultural anthropology really is cross-cultural philosophy almost, at least in the way I was immersed in it. So for somebody who really enjoyed and continue to enjoy traveling so much and learning about other places and ways of thinking, anthropology was ideal because you'd take these courses on religion and magic in sub-Saharan Africa, and I could take courses in Indian art and music cross-culturally, or law and society. So you really just got to think about all these alternative ways of organizing everyday life. And for somebody who was 18, it was a fantastic first degree, led to a second, to my master's, also in Montreal, in social cultural anthropology, where I focused on religion, specifically Pentecostalism and politics and gender. I did some ethnography at that point. That was my introduction to the core practice of anthropology. Traditionally is ethnography, where you immerse in a culture for several months and learn the language if necessary. I went to Central America, Nicaragua. I developed my Spanish, did field work in Pentecostal churches. I really enjoyed that. And I wanted to start making films. I decided it was really important, maybe a little bit like you, Shrujin, to make sure to be involved in sharing what we're learning and excited about.
Mhm.
And it seemed to me that making films could be a really good way to do that, specifically documentary. And having done my studies in Montreal, I was constantly able to consume film and consume documentaries. It was everywhere. It's very much part of that city, if you look for it at least.
Mhm.
So I got a scholarship to go to the UK to do a master's in visual anthropology, which was a program that wasn't offered anywhere in Canada. So I did need to leave the country, went to Goldsmith College in London, England, and did a second master's. They didn't have a PhD offered yet. It was a relatively new area of study at the time. So that got me a second master's. Came back to Montreal to start working in film. This is getting to be a long story, but
No,
I'm
no, please keep going.
so at that point I left academia. You could say I wanted to edit film, produce documentaries, worked with a company in Montreal called Production Multimonde that I had learned about through their films and really enjoyed their work with the NFB and outside the NFB. Was lucky enough to land a little internship position with them and started training and working as a production assistant and editor. But then my husband, I got married quite young, and my husband received his first tenure track position. He had his PhD in Southern Alberta, Lethbridge.
Mhm.
So we ended up moving to Alberta, to a town of 70,000 people at the time, with a great university, University of Lethbridge, but there was not a filmmaking scene or
Right.
landscape. So I was teaching visual anthropology and gender and anthropology. And that within a couple of years, I decided it would make sense for me to see if I could get funding to pursue a PhD, thinking I would end up in Southern Alberta,
Mhm.
where that would be the main career option. And so I moved to Toronto I did get a full scholarship again for York University and their program in social anthropology to work with a medical anthropologist, Naomi Adelson. Started that, and my husband at the time ended up getting a job at York University. So we were both based in Toronto.
Mhm.
And so that's how that evolved. I mean, I started a PhD really for practical purposes. It aligned with my passion as well, but it was almost an accidental return to academia. And it was very fulfilling. I mean, I guess it's a luxury, as you know, to spend entire days reading and being able to think.
Mhm.
Actually, it's a luxury we're more aware of when we become professors, I think, because you don't have that much time to read and think as a professor. You do a lot of committee work or moving projects forward in ways that are rather administrative.
Hmm.
So that pleasure of learning sometimes can be hard to hold on to as an actual professor, but it was very fun to do the PhD. And afterwards, with 2 kids in tow at that point, I got some research positions in Hamilton, which moved me to Hamilton, Ontario, in medical anthropology. And that evolved into a postdoc position, which eventually made me think maybe I want to be a professor after all.
So it seems like you've had not, I would say, not a linear path to where you are today. It's interesting to hear because some other researchers that I've spoken to, it seems like their path, it wasn't something that they always knew what that they wanted to do. It was they let their curiosity lead them, and and they found what their passions were. How important is it, do you think, to be explorative when you're younger in terms of what you want to do and what you want to explore with as a career, as a job? Because I think that's something that a lot of younger professionals do struggle with, especially those trying to get into research or in the global health field. Is what exactly do I do? Like, do I have to know what I want to do right now? Like, I wonder if you have some thoughts about that.
I have a lot of thoughts about that, and it's a good. I like that your questions are grounded in what is it to be human and young and move through life. It's not just about research, which I wasn't sure which way your podcast was going. Any way would have been fine, but it's true that how we make those choices, and I'm 45 now, so you do have more insight
Hmm.
later in life than when you're starting out this career path. I definitely was being driven by passion, and I had, again, I should underline that's obviously a privilege.
Hmm.
I was from a family where, like you, I was very much in a structured household, so that we could do well in school, we could get scholarships for university. That opened doors, right? And made it possible to, first of all, go to university. But I think that one thing that, even yesterday, I was talking about this with a friend, that I've come to realize, and I think you realize by your early 20s, as you start to do, you move somewhere, you're going to, even in high school, you have another side job, maybe at the pharmacy or the coffee shop. And when you finish that year of doing high school and a job, you realize you've learned as much from the job, right? Which has not really been the purpose of that year. That year was finishing grade 12 and maybe making some money. But it's those everyday encounters with other people that are not very structured that you derive so much learning from, so that there's never really any wasted time, as long as you're being attentive to everything there is to learn from every encounter and every day. um, Whether that's, there are crises in a family, or there's wisdom from families or from friends, and there's different economic challenges we go through and decisions we need to make, or you're speaking to people in a restaurant, you have a meal in, and you learn about Nepal, which I learned about many years ago and ended up going to Nepal. I mean, you have to listen to and learn as much as you can, and all of that is really valuable. And that curiosity is a really important driving force for making what can be a hard life much more enjoyable, right? So it is a source of pleasure. Curiosity, it's a good word. And I think cultivating and leaving space in your schedule for appreciating those things that are not in your list of to do, is a really important way to maintain curiosity, which ultimately energizes me, at least. But I hear you. I think a lot of people get energized by exploring. Having a plan, I mean, it's a different world than 25 years ago. I know that people feel, a lot of the students I speak with in undergrad, finishing undergrad, are pretty stressed about the job market, or how many degrees are they going to have to do, and they already have student loans. And we have rising prices of food and housing in Canada.
Hmm.
So it's a more complex landscape that I could see could feel more oppressive and could make people feel like they have to make the right decision sooner. But I also think that almost any experience can be reframed in terms of, for a job application, you will have learned a lot in any experience, even managing a household and children, right? You could convince an employer that those are essential skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in fact, they are very relevant to managing complex projects that are not about children.
Yeah.
So it's good to be aware of how much you are actually learning,
Mm-hmm.
even if sometimes you think, oh, I just did the wrong degree, or, how is this gonna shut down doors to something else? It's unlikely. You might have to do more training if you completely decide to switch directions, sure, and time is limited and money is limited. But if you enjoy what you're doing right now, and it's building your CV in some direction, that's also building your life experience and exposure and hopefully your connections to other people, which
Yeah.
also helps.
Yeah. The part you're talking about earlier, where young professionals needing to feel like they need to know what they want to do. I think at least from the people I've spoken to, I have a lot of friends who are, type A personality people who are like, very driven and, they want to do a lot of things, but there's a big pressure amongst them that I can feel. And I feel the pressure myself too, to
Mhm.
try to, not only know what you want, but to feel like if you don't do all of these things and you're not pushing yourself all the time, you're going to fall behind somehow. And I think to the things that you were pointing to earlier about, the unstable job market right now, rising, housing crisis, or whether, our generation will be able to afford houses in the future, and, rising food costs, all that I think a lot of it is about, like I feel like it comes about like a lot of us did have to sort of grow up a little bit earlier, where we had to be more adult. So talking a little bit about that, when you were a child, what did you aspire to be? Like, I don't think being a researcher was exactly the main focus from an early childhood viewpoint, right?
No, I wanted to be an archaeologist, an Egyptologist to be specific. And that started at a pretty young age, probably around 8. Ancient civilizations was my passion. And in high school, I always wonder if this was valid advice, but my guidance counselor looked up my grades and there were 90s, but then my lowest grade was an 82 in chemistry. And she said, I don't think you should do archaeology because you need a lot of chemistry. Maybe anthropology.
Wow. Oh.
So I thought, okay, well, I really don't like chemistry, so maybe I should listen to this woman. So I don't know. I still watch and try to learn as much as possible about ancient Egypt.
Mhm.
But yeah, as I did I think about being a researcher? No, and that was again something in my household. I was really lucky that my parents didn't talk about us making a certain amount of money,
Mm.
which again, I have a lot of students who come to me and they have a minimum salary they're aiming for. And maybe they've developed that number on their own. Maybe they've heard it from relatives or friends or the internet or YouTube, whatever. It wouldn't have been bad to think about that,
Mhm.
but I got to the only thing I knew is that I would do an undergraduate degree and get a job. We were in my household, we were told that at 18 we will be on our own economically, and we all were. Like, we had to leave the house at 18.
Right.
We were told that when we were 5.
Oh,
At
wow.
18,
At
you're
5.
out. you know you're out of here at 18, so you better figure out how you're going to do that financially. So we had a sense of needing our economic independence,
Mhm.
but when you're 18, you figure you can do that with minimum wage. I wasn't really thinking minimum wage will not be enough for the life I want. So I was lucky that I was able to, in that sense, again, get to university and then do something I really love. When you love something, it's easier to keep doing well at it because more time is easy to put in. It's
Right.
interesting, right? When you're bored, it's really hard to put in the hours you need to move forward in a career or in a job or in an area of study. So the best, what I did have as a kid is the ability to explore through reading, through minimally structured home time.
Hmm.
We read
Hmm.
and were loosed outside, go outside for the whole day. So you did your own thing, which is a way of following your passion too. I mean, when you're outside, you have to find ways to not be bored if you're outside for 6 hours. So probably that's a really good development for a kid. Like you don't have a plan if you're allowed to roam the neighborhood and you have the opportunity to see what's interesting to you and then spend an hour next to an ant hill and then go pick berries off a tree and then,
Hmm.
find people at the park and decide that you're going to play with them all afternoon. Um, I think that we have to be careful about later in life, even as an adult, as my life has become super structured, you can lose space and time for that creativity. And I think without creative space, any job can become boring.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
how do you cultivate that early and how do you maintain it as an undergrad with a part-time job who's worried about the future? I would I would recommend that people try to carve off some time for anything can happen time kind of thing.
Right. Right. And sort of switching gears a little bit here, what are some of the major research and sustainable development projects you've been involved with over the years? And what have you learned from these projects? I think you talked a little bit about, being having to be very self-sufficient and autonomous and independent from sort of a younger age. I'm sure that's probably helped you with some of the projects that you've worked on and managed. Yeah, I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about that.
Hmm. Yeah. So my graduate work has centered on bodily experiences, and really one of the connecting threads throughout my studies that's continued has been working with communities or individuals who are facing a lot of hardships. So the area of focus for my PhD was pain and suffering linked to structural violence, linked to social inequalities and economic marginalization. I think I can see within the context of this interview, certainly I can see that there's a connecting thread there, perhaps to my own awareness of privilege and also need,
Mhm.
which I has been in the back of my mind throughout my life. Um, in terms of sustainable development goals, I wouldn't link it to specific sustainable development goals. My work is in the area of health and well-being, but it has an orientation towards social justice. And as a lot of people have noted, it's not just the explicit references to health and well-being in the SDGs that are relevant. It's also talking about gender equality, talking about access to water and access to housing. When we're talking about peace and security in terms of human rights, I mean, these are also about health and well-being. So I've certainly organized my career around trying to support research initially, but then a bit later with my postdoc, I've put myself as much as possible in the service of programs of service of health service delivery that I respect, organizations that are doing really great work to improve access to healthcare for communities that depend on those programs and projects because of a lack of economic resources. So I've worked with a hospital in Nicaragua and Médecins du Monde on an evaluation of palliative care for children facing cancer. So how do you address pain and suffering for populations that are dependent on a very underfunded public system. I've kind of looked at that sort of question in multiple settings around the world. I'm also really interested increasingly in our responsibilities as researchers going to countries that are not Canada, or going outside communities that we're familiar with within Canada. So we're crossing cultural boundaries, we're crossing class and organizational lines as well to do our work. And what are our responsibilities to ensure that we don't reproduce and deepen historical inequities between whichever population you represent as a researcher, but you certainly are a privileged group in terms of access to authority and influence compared to many other groups around the world when you're a professor. So how do you really collaborate meaningfully? How do you build partnerships meaningfully? So I've become more and more interested in how we work rather than specific topics. I started out with an interest in specific topics that are about suffering and pain and marginalization. And then I started maybe 10 years ago to really ask myself, okay, but how do I avoid reproducing victimizing narratives? How do I avoid deepening historical colonial relationships as I do this research with populations? I'm
Right.
quite centered on methods these days. Actually, ethics and methods of research have become important to me because I think that I've also observed that we do so much research in the space of global health, and the underlying flow of resources and power, including knowledge, expertise, actual resources to fund programs, often doesn't change. So, because the underlying system and structures remain very much centered and controlled by people like myself in the global north, who are the ones writing and calling for certain topics. So how do I remove myself a bit more in a way that's effective? And how am I part of a movement where more and more people are helping to open up space so that everybody else who's been talking all this time but doesn't get heard in our current geopolitical context gets heard more?
Yeah, and I think that's a very important question, a difficult question to tackle. Also, actually talking about one of your other projects, your ethics project, or surrounding consent and compensation in global health research. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that too.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, very excited about this project. It's funded by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. It's a project that emerged after the West Africa Ebola outbreak, which was the focus of quite a bit of research colleagues and I were doing to understand how researchers in West Africa, as well as members of ethics committees, as well as individuals who ended up receiving experimental treatments and vaccines and services during that outbreak, had experienced the influx of largely foreign-funded projects and research initiatives. In working through that research on perceptions of Ebola studies, some colleagues in Guinea, West Africa, from the National Research Ethics Board there, suggested that I mount a project. I was still a postdoc at the time, so that I mount my next project on consent and compensation practices, so that there could be more evidence-based guidelines for the National Research Ethics Committee of Guinea, amongst others. So that project comes out of a need within that National Research Ethics Committee. And for sure, it has been connected to other work I've been involved in. The whole question of how do you get consent from individuals who are sick and afraid in a public health emergency, who are in an isolation center for treatment. What is their capacity to consent to an experimental medication while they are experiencing potentially delusions, vomiting for sure, fever, high fever. So already that is very contested, and we know post that West Africa Ebola outbreak, there's been a lot of writing about consent in the shadow of death.
Mm.
It's really hard to achieve that, and it's been an under considered issue within the context of perhaps healthcare in general. Many would say there's been writing about this in the context of cancer care, for example, at least since the early 80s, but certainly in the context of public health emergencies, where you have critically ill individuals who what are their options? In the case of Ebola, there was no cure, and there was a very strong push from clinicians in affected countries, as well as governments, to fast track research, because initially there was a mortality rate of 90% at the very beginning. So we're talking about an urgent need. And we saw something similar in terms of COVID, in terms of trying to really move things quickly through. So these are very pertinent questions, and I think that there has been progress on it. The other complexity, though, that gets added on outside in a context like Guinea, West Africa, is that you have a large percentage of the population with no limited literacy, maybe no previous contact with researchers or even healthcare facilities. And so how do you have a transaction that aligns with our global commitments, World Medical Association guidelines for ethical research? We have, Declaration of Helsinki and the SIAM's statements on what we need to do as researchers to make sure we're not exploiting people who are vulnerable.
Right.
And when you're sick, you're vulnerable. But that becomes really complicated in places where you're trying to get consent from populations who might not be familiar with a healthcare facility, might not be familiar with research. There's a lot of different concepts combined, as well as the fact that many countries, and we have this in Canada as well, in certain populations, you have high distrust based in historical wrongs or based in ongoing relationships that are exploitative. You'll have distrust of government healthcare facilities or distrust of international pharmaceutical companies. And they're not distrust. I mean, they're based in things people have observed or learned. And so you're also navigating that landscape, and people have a right to be informed and make decisions about whether or not they're going to engage in research. So they are really complex and important questions for us, as certainly as clinical researchers, it's urgent, but even as social scientists. And the issue of payment to participants to research is another really important and under-considered aspect to global health research and clinical trials. We like to construe, in many cases, participation in scientific research as something primarily altruistic. And there is that dimension to people all over the world, even if people are impoverished. Many whom I've interviewed have spoken about their key priority and motivation for participating in trials is that they want to reduce suffering to fellow people who might encounter a particular disease or condition. Altruism is really important. And at the same time, when you're operating a trial in a context where there are limited opportunities for work and access to basic resources, any kind of compensation, whether it's financial or in kind, and often it is soap and food and oil, these things can really reduce free choice, arguably. Now, that's where the conversation gets interesting, because why would we not expect people to make decisions on what to do with their time based on some kind of compensation and Is it exploitation for people to be choosing an opportunity to make money in a clinical trial if they understand the health risks of doing so and the wider benefits of the research? There are big conversations. They haven't been had enough, so I'm happy to be provoking some of those.
Right. I think compensation and actually making sure that we're making people whole, as because in any research you talk about that, that feeling of altruism that many people do feel when contributing to research or participating in it. I think it's even more important because of that feeling that we don't abuse that, because as researchers, I think, and in research, especially from I think a Western perspective, has left a bad taste in people's mouth, and especially globally,
Mhm.
and because of a colonial mentality. And I think that's why it's even probably more important to be aware and to be sensitive regarding that, and to try to make sure that research is being respectful of people's time, and whether that be actually providing actual compensation in the form of payment, or just providing daycare for if people have children, or
Great point.
transportation. Yeah, actually making sure that there's it's not people aren't losing, they're not losing to actually come there a day of pay, or it's they have to pay costs out of pocket to be a part of this research.
Mhm. Yes, and it's been troubling to me to come across in either collegial conversations and sometimes in the literature what is not being said or what is not being asked. I have worked with a group of precariously housed women in Hamilton for a project led by some researchers at McMaster University, and we ended up doing some interviews with them on what does the honorarium mean for your time.
Mhm.
And one of the things that the women spoke about, and these are women who are living in shelters or at best subsidized housing because they were waiting for subsidized housing, a few had gotten it. They noted that a lot of times there's no sense of people who are on the bottom of the economic scale in our urban communities in Canada having limited time as well. There's almost an assumption that they can wait longer for food. That why wouldn't they wait 3 hours at a food bank? What else are they doing? Well, actually, when you're precariously employed or housed, chances are you have less time than anyone else in society because you're having to navigate that landscape, which is really hard, right? Of making sure to cover your basics, plus taking the bus everywhere instead of having a car or living close to affordable food. So that has really stuck with me. The fact that there are paternalistic concerns sometimes within research ethics for protecting the most vulnerable members of society. But within that paternalism, you're also potentially perpetuating inequalities. I mean, we pay a doctor for an interview, sometimes $100 gift card or even $250. And yet, if you are offering $25 for somebody who's using the food bank for a 1 hour interview, people worry about coercion.
Right.
What are you doing there? We have to ask ourselves questions about, are we saying that this person's time is worth nothing because they're not earning?
Right.
Yeah, so I worry about those kinds of messages that we can send out. And I think we do need to have more open conversations that and research where you're asking those who are on the receiving side of these honorariums or compensation or research projects, what are you experiencing? How are you perceiving these practices that we have guidelines for as researchers, but they've been developed for the most part without any insight from the ordinary citizen?
Right. And that feeling of like, is there some sort of coercion? I think it's, or like, are we paying too much for as an honorarium? I think there are certain socioeconomic concerns that do start to creep in that are interesting, because I read a a a piece from a novel a while ago that was released, I think, over a century ago, defining how complex poverty is, in terms of it's actually costs more money to be poor than if you're actually wealthy, right? Because if you're more well off and more privileged, you can buy things that are of higher quality and that last longer, and eventually you end up spending less money. But when you're poorer, you have to buy things that degrade quicker, and in the long term you end up spending more money. So it costs so much money just to be poor. It's such an interesting idea, and something that I think uh, doesn't really get that isn't in a lot of people's thought processes.
Interesting. Send me the name of that book if you remember it.
I can't quite remember, but I will send it to you if I can remember it later. Also, speaking on this topic, what role do you think policies and systems play in strengthening global health systems and the practice of humanitarian healthcare and global health, really? Because I think all there's this, there it comes from a good place. I think the intention of we want to help other people, but I think sometimes it can go about it the wrong way. So yeah, what role do you think policies and systems play in that?
Okay, so I'm gonna just get. Okay, so do you want to policies and systems? I mean, the first question is really, how are you defining policy? Maybe system is a little bit easier. I mean, the systems reproduce themselves.
Mhm.
Policies are more interesting in the sense that this is where you can change and interrupt a system potentially, right? So I think I'll answer it primarily for policy, which we're talking about a directive that ideally is evidence informed
Mhm.
to create a particular outcome or to normalize actions in a particular sphere. I'm we we need ways of working that are consistent. And we need the advantage of a policy is that it's attached to usually okay, if it's a written policy, it will usually have a rationale attached to it that you can find as the person who's expected to implement the policy. So that's useful. And it's really useful in a humanitarian crisis to take away from the individual on the front lines of a humanitarian crisis the need to make decisions. Sometimes, I've heard a lot in many interviews and many research projects from healthcare providers or from directors of programming for a range of humanitarian crises, how important policy is to being able to function in an extremely high stress environment.
Mm.
It might not always serve the best practice or have the best effect after the fact. When they walk away, they might question that policy, but in that moment, being able to not to move forward and decide who's prioritized for care, for example, based on a triage policy, enables them to move forward in this really high stress situation and enables some kind of system to emerge within that healthcare facility in a humanitarian crisis that otherwise would be chaotic, in their words, right? There are limited resources. There is more need than resources. You need ways of figuring out what to do that align with predetermined priorities and values, including equity or considerations for pre-existing vulnerability or optimal use of those limited resources. So policy does certainly have its place. And at the same time, there's no question that a policy is not the same thing as what happens in reality. And there can be deviation from policy, and depending on the context. I'm thinking frontline healthcare, which obviously is not the only place at all that you have policy, but I think it's because you mentioned humanitarian crisis, and that's what's uppermost in my mind. There, people still have their own moral compasses and will deviate from a policy if they feel they can't live with themselves, if they don't do something that is not what they're supposed to do. So yeah, there's never an exact replicate of policy in practice, but it certainly has a really important role in terms of organizing chaos and making more transparent what we're doing in those spaces. Ideally, and where we're going in terms of global health increasingly, is that policies need to be co-developed, co-initiated, and co-evaluated in terms of their effectiveness with the affected communities and populations, because that's where things have gone wrong. And we have developed a lot of policies in and for global health without consulting, and we, as in experts with PhDs in universities or in organizations, have developed policies based maybe on clinical evidence, but if you don't have conversations that build trust and are based on trust and take into account local beliefs and preferences, you can end up putting into place a policy that feels offensive, that feels like a colonial imposition. And then you're wasting resources again. You're wasting time, money, you're breaking trust instead of doing something good. So the context through which policies get introduced, developed, and monitored is just as important as the policy itself.
I think a great example of that we learned in our global health systems master's degree at Western was the this machine at for a playground which kids could turn. It was a turbine. It was a pump where they could get water out of a well. But it was seen as this great achievement, and it was replicated. I mean, there was no studies done on it. It was just replicated across all, like, I believe dozens of different schools. And when they followed up, 6 months later, they found that it was derelict. No one had used it at all because it was built with no consideration for the actual local community that was actually using it, because it was so unwieldy and large. You'd have literally 60 kids would have to get together to push this little thing. And it's completely like it does not work as just a convenient way to actually get water. It's much easier for them to actually like get a rope and get a bucket and go into the well. Like, it doesn't make sense. It was just seen as, ultimately, I mean, by the community members, as just this, a thing to do to make the people who had brought the funding happy.
Oh
Which,
dear.
I mean, it's just complete. I mean, it was a really bad example of how when certain programming is ill implemented, it can have very negative impacts for the community you're actually trying to serve.
Mm-hmm. And conversely, if a policy is developed in dialogue with the community it aims to serve, it's symbolically charged either way, right? So it can do so much more than just deliver on a service or improve particular health outcomes. It's also recognizing the value of that population's ideas and priorities.
Right. And
That's
if
also part of our sustainable development plan, right? If we want health equity for all, that's not just about healthy bodies, that's about dignified existences and equal access to dignity.
right. And if they had, if the people implementing that project had, from those organizations, had consulted the community members, it would have saved the. I mean, first of all, it was outside of just dehumanizing the community members and essentially treating them as props in many ways, because it was for a photo op. It would have saved tons of just unnecessary spending, like just so much money that could have been saved to actually go towards useful projects that would have helped the people that the programs were intended to help,
Yeah.
and treated them as and engendered trust. All of that completely gone, just drained, just gone down the toilet, basically.
Yeah. And that is probably the pragmatism of community engagement and consultation and collaboration partnership. The fact that it will allow for more efficient and effective work is the primary argument that is continuously repeated in the global health space, and that is driving, I would say, good participatory practices in global health research or in global health in general. But it's really important to, I mean, it's really important to acknowledge and make sure that not lost in the conversation is the fact that you can't change inequities without changing our relationship to one another as humans. You mentioned dehumanizing. There's a philosopher, Nancy Fraser, who has a book called Redistribution or Recognition, or Recognition and Redistribution. And her argument is that you can't just redistribute resources. You have to redistribute access to being valued as a human at the same time, because otherwise it's not sustainable what you're doing. That's where the change has to happen, is in recognizing one another on equal grounds. And you can do that's at least a big simplification of her argument, but it is one of the points she's making, is this really close and integral connection between recognition and redistribution.
Right. And it's sort of more, outside of just a material difference change. It has to
Correct.
be more of a philosophical change, really. It's an internal change that has to happen in terms of the thinking of people who are in high levels when it comes to humanitarian care, really.
Social, yeah, it's a social, political change, as well as that change in the flow of resources that are material.
Right. And for a new researcher, a young person, or an academic interested in the fields that you've worked in and what we've been talking about, what advice would you have for them in terms of, making, a lot of younger people, I think, have a strong desire to make a positive difference, and they have if they have interest in these fields, what would your advice be for them to go about
Mhm.
doing that? Like, just first steps, or if is there
Yes.
big things that they should, really try to do?
Yes. Well, I think one thing, a first step and ongoing step, is to examine one's motivations critically. We teach reflexivity a lot. It's now part of the core competencies in global health across the world where that's taught. And I think that that's a really important element and characteristic of any person in the global health space, because there's a lot of potential to do harm. Um, yeah, it is a landscape that by definition, global health is about inequalities. So when you enter that space with certain degrees or with a particular passport, you end up with power. And with that power, there comes power to do harm. So it's really important for people to constantly examine how they're working, and what's driving them, and what does it mean to do good. That question has to be asked. Um, and I think that the other thing that is interesting in terms of sustainability and equity is that we're getting really good as scholars and in global health, at defining sustainability for systems and programs and societies. Let's not lose sight of the connection to everybody who's involved in social change has to also not burn out. And I don't want to bring this all back to an individual, but we also have to be thinking about what sustains us to be able to continue to engage in work that involves looking into suffering and forest fires, and our
Mhm.
world is a mess. So how are you going to sustain yourself
Mm.
as you engage in this work? Because I think that if we don't leave some room and time to make sure that you're remaining connected to people around you, and to a motivation that's bigger than yourself, and that goes beyond the typical accolades of our society, which is high social status, high economic achievement, publications.
Right.
Right.
Adulation, recognition. Yeah.
Yeah, that stuff, as you get older, I don't know, it feels shallow eventually. So you have to watch out for making sure that you have other things that are driving you, that are a bit more profound and sustainable, and will sustain you, whether that is people's connections with a particular community, or being in nature and feeling connected to the non-human world in meaningful ways. But we're going through a huge historical shift as a planet and as societies. And I think it's really the more people who can be critically oriented and working towards global health equity, great, but let's make sure that those fantastic people don't burn out.
That's a really interesting point because I've never thought about that. Certainly, is that as some, thinking about sustainable development, that first part is actually trying to sustain yourself. That's in. I've never even thought about like, I guess, like trying to create a car, making sure that there's a space for yourself that you're not burning out.
Yeah.
I think there's always just been an assumption, especially within nonprofit NGO work and sustainable development, that everyone is just motivated by passion. You just go 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 all the time, and there isn't a real like, and everyone has just this internal infinite engine that you can just keep going all the time,
Mhm.
and I don't think it's probably not very realistic. I mean, you do burn out eventually.
Yeah, it might be possible for some people, but there is such a variety. I'm an anthropologist, so my thing is the variety of ways of being human, right?
Right.
And I think that for many people, it doesn't look like go, 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 go to remain grounded and um, to be able to connect to people and to connect to your issues, whatever those are, and to your passions, which are maybe global health equity issues. You need to, yeah, remain somewhat healthy and alert and not be numbed by the overwhelm of work.
Right. And sort of circling back to about your earlier years here with the final question, how do you think the values and customs which you've been instilled with from your background have informed the person you are today, both in a personal sense but also a professional sense?
Oh, great question. We're very hardworking in my family, and I have been lucky that, I guess lucky, I realize now lucky. I felt like I was brought up a little bit in a military household.
Mm.
There were a lot of rules, and there was spare time if you were out of the space, then you were free. But if you were in my parents' space, it was very structured. And I think that that was a useful custom to get that that's good for work ethic. Um, Schedules are good customs for our North American culture for the most part. Maybe that's changing. Work is changing.
Mm.
Um, and values. Yeah, I mean, I have, so my parents, I'll try to make this, I will make it brief, but my parents are from different social classes. So my mom has a very working class, Polish peasant laborer background. And my father is middle class. Mother was divorced, so not wealthy, but his mother did come from a wealthier family. And they were subjected to a lot of judgment by the wealthier family in terms of the lower class family. Those two extended families didn't get along. And there was a lot of judgment that was classist. That the fact that my parents did not agree with that or reproduce that, and in fact made sure to make it clear that they thought it was not acceptable to judge people based on their class background, is probably a core value that has guided my own work.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dr. Nouvet, for the interview today. I really appreciate it. And it's been a really insightful learning, not just about your academic and professional journey, but just also you as a person and your background. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Sujane, and good luck with everything.